Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive.
Our mission is pretty simple.
Yeah.
You, our listeners, bring us a stack of sources, could be articles, research papers, notes, whatever, and we dive in, pull out the most important bits, the key insights, basically giving you the shortcut to, getting up to speed.
Exactly.
And today, we're diving into something really fascinating. You shared a paper titled Power of Dark Knowledge in Visuo-Spatial Learnography and some related notes you had. And no, this isn't about like secret codes or anything. It's about a hidden layer of knowledge inside your own mind. The sources call it dark knowledge.
Yeah.
So we're going to try and figure out what exactly that is, maybe where it lives in the brain, how it's different from, say, the usual classroom learning.
Right, the stuff we normally think of as learning.
And maybe why it could be, well, crucial for creativity, innovation, especially in subjects like math, which can be pretty tricky.
Absolutely. It's a shift in perspective because we often focus so much on conscious learning, right?
Yeah.
Reading, memorizing, the explicit stuff.
But these sources, they're suggesting there's this whole other powerful system kind of operating under the radar, shaping how we understand and do things, often without us even being aware of it.
It sounds a bit like, dark matter in physics. You see its effects, but you can't directly point to it easily.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually.
So our mission today, shine a light on this dark knowledge. Where did the sources even start defining it? How is it different from, like, textbook knowledge?
Well, the paper draws a really clear line. That textbook stuff, facts, figures, things that are structured, you can explain them easily. What you get in the lecture, they call that white knowledge.
White knowledge, okay. Clear, explicit, conscious.
Exactly. The stuff you'd study for an exam.
Got it. So dark knowledge is the opposite, hidden stuff.
It's different. They describe it as intuitive, nonverbal, often subconscious. And critically, it's not just tucked away somewhere. The sources say it's embedded. Yeah, like it forms an invisible architecture, sort of underneath your actual skills that we can see. They use phrases like an ocean of deep knowledge or a wellspring of intuitive understanding. Think less about a list of facts you memorized and more about the feeling, the system that lets you just know how to ride a bike or maybe spot a pattern in a tricky math problem without consciously ticking off every rule.
Okay, so white knowledge is like reading the recipe instructions, step by step. And dark knowledge is more like the experienced chef who just feels how much spice to add or when the dough is right.
That's a great way to put it. It's that embodied understanding, not just the intellectual part. And this dark knowledge, this intuition, it seems especially active in a specific kind of learning the sources focus on. They call it Visuo-Spatial Learnography.
Visuo-Spatial Learnography. Okay, that sounds technical. What does that actually involve? What kind of learning is that?
It's basically a learning process that leans heavily on, well, your vision, how you map out space in your head, and importantly, your motor memory.
Motor memory, like muscle memory.
Exactly. The memory tied to physical actions and movements. And this process uses those things much more than, say, purely abstract thought or language.
Visual, spatial, and motor.
Yeah.
Doing things.
Yeah.
I could see how that connects. And the sources said this is really important for math.
Absolutely. Yeah, think about geometry or algebra, trigonometry. They aren't just abstract symbols. You're often visualizing shapes, understanding how things relate in space, manipulating symbols which even mentally often involves a kind of motor action like tracing it in your mind or physically writing or drawing it.
Right.
So the argument is that this type of learning, visuo-spatial learnography, really taps into those dark knowledge pathways.
By, like, actually drawing stuff, making models.
Precisely that, yeah. Activities where you're exploring visually and spatially diagramming a problem, maybe building a little model of something, even using hand gestures while you explain or learn. These things seem to bypass some of the purely verbal routes and directly engage that deeper, intuitive, often nonverbal understanding. That's the idea, anyway. That's where the dark knowledge lives.
That makes a lot of sense. You're not just hearing about it, you're interacting physically, visually. Okay, so if dark knowledge is this deep well, and visuospatial learnography is a way to get to it, what powers it? What makes the system actually work? The notes mentioned something called zeid energy.
They did, yeah. Zeid energy, it's defined in the paper as the working potential of knowledge transfer.
Working potential. like the fuel.
Kind of, yeah. Think of it as the dynamic force, the energy that lets that intuitive dark knowledge actually flow and become useful. It's what powers the formation of those gut feelings, those intuitive ideas, and helps with problem solving,
Right.
especially within these structures they mentioned called brainpage modules. It apparently helps you focus, perform tasks better, almost like getting into a flow state, but for intuitive stuff.
Interesting. And there was something related to zeid factor linked to mistakes.
Right, the zeid factor. They link that to controlling like competing impulses when you're learning or doing something. And yeah, interestingly, they connect it to mistakes.
How are mistakes part of it? Usually we think of mistakes as, well, bad.
Well, according to these sources, mistakes aren't just failures. They're framed as a form of the zeid factor that actually helps fix problems.
Ah,
They literally call a mistake a great teacher because it instantly shows you where your current approach is off, right? And it redirects that zeid energy, that working potential, towards figuring out a better way.
so getting something wrong isn't just failing, it's the system itself flagging an error and redirecting its own power to correct it.
That's the idea presented, yeah. It reframes mistakes as part of the learning engine itself.
Wow, okay. That's a different way to look at errors. Now, you mentioned brain page modules just now. What
Yeah.
exactly are those?
Right, brainpage modules, they're pretty central to this whole model. The sources propose that these modules are actually constructed and practiced mainly through the learner's motor circuits.
Motor circuits. You mean the brain pathways we use for physical movement, like writing or drawing.
Exactly, those. The idea is that they get built through activities like writing, like drawing diagrams, maybe building physical things, any kind of motor activity where you're engaging with the knowledge physically.
Okay.
And these modules, they encode the knowledge, they store it, and they allow you to sort of rehearse it internally. And the research they cite found that actually using these motor pathways to encode information
Yeah.
is apparently more effective than just passively listening, like in a standard lecture.
More effective for what? Remembering?
For creating automatic, durable recall. Knowledge you can access intuitively, quickly, without having to consciously dredge it up because it's been built into the system via these motor activities.
Whoa. Hold on. So the physical act of taking notes or sketching out an idea or even using your hands when you talk about something, you're not just making a record. You're potentially using your body's motor system to actually build a neurological structure in your brain that holds that knowledge differently, more deeply.
That's the core argument, yes. It's directly linking that physical interaction with knowledge to building this robust, intuitive understanding.
Okay.
And this embedded, intuitive, dark knowledge built through these visuo-spatial methods, fueled by the zeid energy and structured in these motor-built brain page modules.
Yeah.
This is what the sources present as having a really profound connection to creativity and innovation.
Right. You mentioned that earlier. That's a pretty big claim that dark knowledge is the main source of creativity. How do they explain that?
It is a strong claim, yeah, but that's what the paper argues. It suggests that dark knowledge provides the raw materials. They call them sequences of smart objects.
Smart object.
Yeah, from which genuinely new intuitive ideas can emerge. They even connect it directly to Einstein's famous quote, the only real valuable thing is intuition. The author argues that the intuition Einstein was talking about is this dark knowledge. It's the fundamental root of where creativity comes from.
So breakthrough ideas might not always come from conscious logical steps,
Yeah.
but bubble up from this deeper, maybe subconscious world of dark knowledge beyond imagination, as they put it.
That's the picture they're painting, yeah. It suggests creativity has this deeper, less conscious origin. And to understand the how in the brain, they really lean on motor science.
Motor science keeps coming up. It seems counterintuitive that physical movement is so tied to knowledge transfer and creativity.
Well, the paper argues that the sheer power and precision of knowledge transfer is deeply linked to our motor system, especially the upper limb, arm, forearm, hand, fingers.
Okay.
Think about how incredibly complex and precise skilled actions are, playing an instrument, typing fast, surgery. These require amazing automation and control learned through the motor system. And the research they highlight points to specific brain areas. Of course, there's the motor cortex involved in planning movement, but they put a lot of emphasis on subcortical sites, places like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum.
Basal ganglia, cerebellum. I usually associate those with coordinating movement, maybe balance, or unfortunately with conditions like Parkinson's. Why are they so central to learning here?
Good question. It's because while they definitely talk to the motor cortex, these subcortical structures also have this really important output pathway
Yeah.
that actually bypasses the motor cortex. It connects via the brainstem to influence deeper, less conscious parts of the brain. The sources call this bypass the main route of learning operation.
Wait. So the main root of the learning operation uses a pathway that skips the conscious motor control center, the cortex, and goes somewhere deeper, more automatic.
That's the proposal. They note that these subcortical sites, the basal ganglia and cerebellum, are where well-learned skilled behavior gets stored and controlled. You know, the things you do automatically.
It's like riding that bike.
Exactly. The motor cortex seems more involved in initiating the learning, getting the transfer started, but the actual execution of those skilled, learned patterns relies on these deeper subcortical loops.
So the cortex starts it, but the deep brain runs it.
Sort of, and interestingly, they mention that damage to the motor cortex prevents you from forming new skilled motor patterns, which shows its role in the initial learning. But the long-term storage and smooth execution seems to live elsewhere in those subcortical areas.
Wow. It suggests the brain uses the same pathways for highly skilled physical actions as it does for deep intuitive knowledge. Like the knowledge itself becomes a kind of highly skilled internal action.
That's a really insightful way to think about it. Yeah, it fits the analogy. And the sources also mention other areas chipping in, like the posterior parietal cortex and the hippocampus, involved in processing the visuo-spatial info and motor feedback, helping to build and use this whole intuitive knowledge structure. So it's a network for sure, but the spotlight is really on the motor system and those subcortical shortcuts.
Okay, this paints a very, very different picture of learning than, sitting quietly and listening. If traditional classrooms focus on white knowledge and conscious thought, how does this research suggest we actually use this understanding of dark knowledge? You mentioned the Taxila model and happiness classroom.
Yes, exactly. The Taxila model is presented as the application, the practical framework, and it includes this idea of a happiness classroom. And the core criticism here is that conventional classrooms heavy on talking, listening, memorizing, they just don't really use these intuitive, motor, and subcortical brain regions very much.
So they limit our access to this dark knowledge potential.
That's the argument. They suggest these methods effectively limit access. So the shift isn't just about, better lectures or more engaging teachers.
It's more fundamental.
It's more fundamental, yeah. The sources argue we should move away from focusing only on teaching performance, like how motivated the teacher is or how clearly they explain, and move towards providing the actual system and process for knowledge transfer that taps into and is powered by the learner's own brain mechanisms, their own zeid energy.
Empowering the learner's brain to do the heavy lifting, basically.
It got it. It's about facilitating that internal process.
And these happiness classrooms,
yeah,
designed around this idea, they actually worked? You saw results?
Apparently, yes. By using things like their brainpage theory, setting up miniature schools, which sound like spaces designed for hands-on motor-based learning, and using peer modules where students collaborate and teach each other, likely involving physical interaction and demonstration, they reported some really positive outcomes.
Like what?
Things like increased intrinsic motivation, students wanting to learn for its own sake, deeper engagement, stronger emotional connections to what they were learning, more collaboration, and this thing called reciprocal learnography.
Reciprocal learnography.
Yeah, where students are dynamically teaching and learning from each other, embedding the knowledge through interaction.
They also mentioned SOTIM, S-O-T-I-M.
Yeah.
As a framework.
Right, SOTIM. Stands for Space, Object, Time, Instance, Module. It's presented as a specific way to structure learning experiences.
How so?
To intentionally organize them across these dimensions, considering the space, the objects used, the timing, specific examples or instances, and how they form modules specifically to enhance those dark knowledge pathways, making it easier to build and retrieve knowledge intuitively.
Got it. And there was one last point about motivation. Something about dopamine.
Ah, yes, a little caution tucked in there. While motivation, often driven by dopamine release, gives pleasure and can drive learning initially.
Yeah.
The source warns it can be a bit addictive and potentially less effective for deep, lasting learning compared to engaging the learner's own internal knowledge transfer engine, the zeid energy system described. The focus shifts from chasing an external reward or feeling to empowering the internal system.
Okay, let me try and wrap my head around this. So, the sources argue, dark knowledge is this powerful, intuitive, often subconscious understanding.
Right.
Totally different from conscious white knowledge. It thrives in Visuo-Spatial Learnography, learning through seeing, spatial reasoning, and using motor skills. This whole system runs on zeid energy, the potential for knowledge transfer. Mistakes aren't failures, but part of a corrective zeid factor.
Yep.
We build deep, lasting knowledge by creating brainpage modules through physical activities like writing and drawing. And this dark knowledge isn't just for skills. It's supposedly the main source of creativity and intuition.
That's the core idea.
And the brain science points to motor pathways, especially subcortical areas like the basal ganglia and cerebellum, using a bypass route as the main route of this learning operation.
Correct.
Traditional teaching might miss this. So they proposed the taxila model, happiness classrooms, miniature schools, peer learning, and frameworks like SODM to tap into it, focusing on the learner's internal system.
You've synthesized it beautifully, and that leads to the really interesting bit.
Yeah.
The big takeaway from these sources isn't just, here are some new teaching tricks. It's really a call for a major rethink, a paradigm shift.
A shift towards what?
Towards recognizing and actively empowering the learner's own built-in, motor-driven, intuitive brain processes, their own zeid energy. It's about trusting and enabling the brain's natural way of deep learning.
It sounds like they're saying the real power for learning isn't something teachers pour in, but something that's already inside you, the learner.
Exactly.
Just waiting for the right kind of activity, the right kind of engagement to unlock it.
Precisely. It's already there.
Wow. Okay, so we've taken a dive into this, well, this hidden world of dark knowledge. How it seems to work through seeing, hearing, moving, powered by this zeid energy. Its deep link to creativity, intuition, and how different it seems from just focusing on explicit, verbal, white knowledge.
And understanding this whole framework, it really does suggest there's this huge intuitive potential sitting inside your brain, listener, just waiting.
Waiting to be tapped.
Yeah, and maybe the key isn't just more thinking or more listening, but more nonverbal engagement, more using your motor system, more visual and spatial interaction with ideas.
So what does this all mean for us, for you listening? Well, here's a final thought to chew on. If motor science and these deep unconscious brain pathways really are a main route of knowledge transfer, as these sources claim, and if that dark knowledge, built through doing, is the wellspring of creativity, how much of your own learning potential, your own creative spark, is just sitting there untapped, waiting for you to unlock it simply by doing more, seeing more, moving more in relation to what you want to learn, rather than just thinking about it?